Shavua Tov, everyone. I say this every year, and it's only ever more true before every Shabbat Hagadol and Shabbat Shuva Derasha, which is what a personal privilege I consider it to be able to share words of Torah with each of you as I look around this Zoom screens, those whose videos are on, and those who I just see your names. You're each cherished members of our Bayit family and extended family. And it's a gift and a privilege to share words with you as we anticipate this most momentous Chag of Pesach. Before I share my words with you, I want to make note of the fact that this year, if you've been to the grocery store, you know that Pesach costs more than any prior year. In the Bayit, we try to help those in our community and those we're connected to beyond our community to make Pesach with dignity and comfort. We give out a lot of funds through Ma'od Chitim, one of the most essential mitzvot of this season. And we've given out more than we've received so far. So if you're able, within your means, to make a Ma'od Chitim gift to the Bayit, or do a little extra, please know it will help those in the community who need support to have a meaningful and joyous Pesach. Acheinu kol Beit Yisrael, Acheinu kol Beit Yisrael, hanetunim betzara ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום ירחם עליהם ויוציאם מצרה לרווחה, ומאפלה לאורה, ומשיבוד לגאולה השתה, בגלה ובזמן קריב. Mishibud ligula, from servitude and captivity to redemption. Hashta, may it be now. What are we aiming to achieve 48 hours from now when we sit down around the Seder table? Especially this year, 6 months into war, with 133 captives observing Pesach in captivity, our precious hostages. Their families aching for their return, all of us aching for their return, knowing all too well deep in our hearts that too many are no longer alive. What do we want to achieve this Pesach around our Seder table, knowing there are hundreds of families mourning the losses of loved ones murdered on October 7th? Hundreds of families of Chayalim missing their father or daughter or spouse around the Seder table, who sacrificed their lives for our safety. What do we want to achieve this Pesach around the Seder table with the anguish of the consequences of war? So many families decimated, lives taken on the Gazan side, so many hungry mouths. What do we want to achieve this Pesach around our Seder table, with tens of thousands observing the Seder in Israel in a place they don't live because they've been displaced from their homes? What do we want to achieve around the Seder table this Pesach, when slogans calling for the destruction of Jews have become commonplace around the world and in our own cities and on far too many campuses? This Pesach, when the dream of peace and coexistence feels so crushingly far away. I recite this list, this litany of the things we're dealing with, the hostages, the chayalim, the displaced families, the suffering on the other side, so often. At the beginning of a drasha, a program, a gathering, it runs the risk of becoming rote. And yet it's so utterly overwhelming. Every dimension of this is a world, a universe. So I pray nearly 200 days in, that we have the strength, the capacity to keep feeling everything we need to be feeling, doing everything we can be doing to try to bring us to a better place. So what do we aim to achieve around our Seder tables in this most difficult of years? I want to ask the question a different way, or maybe a different question. What is the draw of the Seder? What is the magnetic pull, the one that brings so many less observant or unaffiliated Jews back to practice their Judaism, to travel from wherever they are to their family's table, to observe the Pesach, even if they don't observe so many other things? The thing that brings perhaps more memories of any Jewish ritual than any other for each of us, our memories of the Seder, our experiences of that most powerful night. If I look into my own emotions, my own neshama, it's not so much the mitzvot or the songs, it's the gathering. It's the coming together of family and friends who are like family, our inner circle, to participate in this structured ritual of Jewish peoplehood, one that leaves room for individual participation and creativity. Everyone has a voice and a role, something to add. And if this is the compelling power of the Seder, then maybe what we aim to achieve this year is to experience that wholeheartedly, to lean into the coming together with our inner circle around the Seder table. But I have to ask, is there anything hard about the gathering of our friends and family? Are there tension points as we anticipate sitting down around the Seder table with that group? Maybe there are people there we love, but don't like. People we care about, but we couldn't disagree with more about their life choices or their viewpoints, religious, social, or political. If that's true for you as you anticipate your Seder and its challenges, welcome to 21st century American Judaism. Or maybe just welcome to Judaism. Or maybe just welcome to the human family. If your answer is no, you're anticipating a smooth Seder with no tension, conflict, or differences of opinion, then either you forgot to invite some of your family and friends, or you've managed to build an echo chamber, or you're miles ahead of most of us in cultivating the open sharing of diverse viewpoints, and I'd like to learn from you. Or maybe this is it. We make that pact, a pact that has pros and cons, that will all be on our best behavior and leave the things we disagree with and about away from the Seder table. And sometimes we need to do that, and we shouldn't feel badly about that. But we ignore the things that we disagree about or that divide us only at our own peril. We have to sometimes talk about them, engage them. Tonight I want to suggest to you that the sages and the rabbis who followed them knew that the Seder night is challenging, that we will sit around the table with people we love but disagree with, some who think our viewpoints are totally wrong, and about whom we feel the same. And tonight I want to suggest that the Haggadah built in a little moment for us, a little story, that enables us to see ourselves as part of a long-standing tradition of sitting around the table with close people with whom we struggle mightily. And that as we turn that moment around and around, we will find it teaches us a lot of lessons about how we can engage each other at the Seder table in the hardest times. We have to ask about this moment in the Haggadah. How did it get here? What is it teaching us? And what might it have been modeled on? And how can it guide us about how to have the best Seder, the best moment of gathering with the people we love, even when we disagree? To identify and understand what this moment in our Haggadah is and why it is so special, we have to refresh our memories about the evolution of the Haggadah. The Mishnah in Source 1 tells us about the framework for how the Haggadah is supposed to work. It tells us, and sorry if it's a little small, it tells us, the attendants poured the second cup for the leader of the Seder, and the child asks the parent questions. And if the child doesn't know how, the parent teaches them, and then the Mishnah goes on to list all the questions the child asks on that night, what we now refer to as the Manishtana. And then the Mishnah goes on to tell us, in its proto-Haggadah, in its description of what the Haggadah is supposed to be. According to the intelligence of the child, the parent teaches, beginning with disgrace and concluding with glory, and expounding the passage, Arami Oved Avi, an Aramean sought to destroy my father, until concluding the entire section. When we look further, we see that these instructions of the Mishnah actually play out to a large degree in how the beginning of the Magid takes place. We have the introduction, the Halach Ma'anya, where we invite everyone around the table. Then, just like the Mishnah tells us to do, the child asks the parent the 4 questions. And then we start answering the questions using the framework of beginning with disgrace and ending with praise. And we start with the hard story, Abadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. Then our Haggadah has the story of Rabbi Eliezer and the 5 sages sitting at Bnei Brak. This doesn't seem to be anticipated by the Mishnah. When the Mishnah tells us what's supposed to happen at the Seder night, it doesn't tell us we should tell a story about some sages who were having a Seder. Neither the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says I was like 70. Then we get back on track. We have the Baruch HaMakom introduction and the 4 children, which is the fulfillment of what the Mishnah says to us when it says, according to the intelligence of the child, the parent teaches. And there we come to understand that there are all different kinds of children with all different learning styles, and we accommodate each of them. And then we go on to tell the beginning of the second version of the story, Mitchila. Again, our ancestors worshipped idols. Again, starting with disgrace, the difficult times in our past as we move towards the redemption. And finally, we have the Vehisha Amda, which tells us of God's promise to protect us, that leads us into the Aramia of Eravi, the long section, the heart of the Magid, which is the Midrash that the Mishnah is telling us about. And so it's clear that the way our Haggadah actually begins, the first half of the Magid, follows precisely upon the instructions that the Mishnah gives for how the Seder night is supposed to proceed. Except for those couple of little things in the middle. The story of Rabbi Eliezer and the sages sitting at Bnei Brak, which the Mishnah doesn't tell us we're supposed to talk about or include in our Haggadah. And yet it comes to be included in all of our Haggadot. But it wasn't always that way. Even a good 800 years after the Mishnah was concluded, if we look at source 3, in the Haggadah of Rav Sadia Gaon, one of the Gaonim who lived around the year 1000, we find this part is missing. First we have the Manishtana, why is this night different from all other nights? Then we have the Abadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and God took us out. And then all of a sudden, Rav Sadia Gaon's Haggadah jumps to the Arba Banim, to the 4 children. He leaves out the story of the sages at Bnei Brak, because it doesn't seem to fit the paradigm that the Mishnah lays out for us. So why is it there in our Haggadah? What is it teaching us if it's not part of what the Mishnah envisions we're supposed to do on the Seder night? To understand, we have to read the story and its commentaries. So let's begin. Maaseh b'Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yoshua v'Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah v'Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbi Tarfon. A story that happened on Pesach night, when these 5 sages, Hayu Mesubim b'Bnei Brak, they were reclining in Bnei Brak, and they were telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt that whole night, until their students came and said to them, Higia zman kriyat shema shal shacharit. The time for the morning Shema has come. What do we learn from this story? First of all, it begins with the word maaseh, a happening. In Mishnaic language, in the language of the sages, a happening comes either to prove or disprove a point. Now, if you remember your Haggadah, you know that right before this passage, the Abadim Hayinu ends with the instruction that even if we were all wise and all sagely and all elders, we would still have to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And so then comes this story as a ma'aseh, as a story to prove the point. Here were a bunch of rabbis who were all wise and elder sages and endowed with great insight, and yet they still gathered to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. So on the face of it, this is a story coming to prove the point that we all have to engage in the Haggadah on the Seder night. But I think this is a bit of a cover. Did the Haggadah need to go out of its way to tell us that the most learned and wise people need to participate in the Seder? If anything, tell me that the most disconnected Contrarian, disillusioned, impoverished, and downtrodden people need to tell the story on the Seder night. They're the ones who I wouldn't expect around the Seder table. They're the ones who need a pep talk to come and participate. So I'm convinced that there's something more to this ma'aseh, more to this story, than just proving the point about the fact that we all have to participate in the Seder night. As we delve deeper, hopefully we will understand. Who are the subjects, the characters of this story? 5 rabbis. These rabbis were not just regular old folks. They were epic scholars. They were moral leaders. They were the heroes of their time. And what was the time? It was the time a generation after the destruction of the Second Temple, a time in which the Jewish people were undergoing tremendous challenge, tremendous upheaval. And these were the people leading them through this time. And they were scattered all around the land of Israel. Why would they all leave their homes to spend the Seder in one place? And why specifically at Rabbi Akiva's place? When it says that they were reclining in Bnei Brak, we know from the Talmud that that's where Rabbi Akiva lived. They left their homes in other cities and came to celebrate the Seder with Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva was amongst the youngest among these, a junior faculty member. Usually the senior faculty don't go to the junior faculty's house. It's the other way around. Why did the elders go to their student, Rabbi Akiva's home, for the Seder? What do we know about what they did on this night? Just that they told the story of the Exodus the whole night, longer than even the Exlers do, whose Seder ends at 2 a.m. They went all the way until the morning Shema. At the surface, this last part is the ma'aseh, the story, demonstrating the fulfillment of the very last line of the Abadim Hayinu, which tells us that V'kol hamarbe lesaper b'siat Mitzrayim harei ze meshubach. The longer, the more you tell the story of the Exodus, the more praiseworthy. So, on the face of it, this story comes along to tell us an example of people who really did the mitzvah. They told the story the whole night. But there were no doubt other Seders that could have proved this point. So why is this story so important and so central to get a place in our Haggadah? We'll turn now to a few of the commentaries from the last few centuries who've wondered the same thing. And from each of their answers, I hope we'll glean a different important message about what we need to be doing around our Seder tables, especially this year. The first teaching comes from the Chida, an 18th century Sephardic rabbi and prolific Talmid Chacham, who points out to us that each of these rabbis had an unusual relationship with the Exodus. Here's what he says. It's possible in Source 5 that the intention of the statement, everyone who tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt is praiseworthy, is talking about Kohanim and Leviim. The sages say that even though the tribe of Levi was not subjugated in Egypt, they were obligated to tell the story of the Exodus along with all the other commandments which we were given on Passover. And so the statement V'chol hamarbe comes to include the Kohanim and Leviim who were not enslaved. And it's hinted at in the expression and abbreviation V'chol, and all, which, says the Chida, is an acronym for Va'afilu Kohen V'Levi. Even a Kohen and a Levi have to tell the story of the Exodus at length. A proof for this, says the Chida, is brought from our story, the story of the sages at Bnei Brak who stayed up the whole night telling the story of the Exodus. If we look carefully, he tells us, most of them were Kohanim and Leviim. Rabbi Yoshua in the story is Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania, who was a Levi. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Tarfon were Kohanim. Also, converts and their offspring were not enslaved, since they were not amongst those who were originally part of the Exodus from Egypt. If you're the descendant of a convert, your ancestor wasn't a slave in Egypt. It is for them that we say, all who increase to tell the story is praiseworthy, to include Kohanim, Leviim, and converts or the descendants of converts like Rabbi Akiva. Tradition tells us Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of converts to Judaism. Even though he was a descendant of converts, he elaborated on the story of the Exodus. What's the Chida telling us? He's telling us that all the people at the Seder of Bnei Brak were not actually people whose ancestors went from slavery to freedom on that night. Rabbi Akiva's ancestors weren't even ever in Egypt, and the ancestors of the others who were Kohanim and Leviim were in Egypt, but they weren't slaves. So the Exodus experience was for them an experience of moving out of Egypt, but not an experience of being redeemed from slavery. But still, these rabbis got together to tell the story, to lay claim to the belief that what happens to us as a nation happens to us as a nation, even if it didn't happen to our family. Because as Rav Avi has taught us and continues to model for us all the time, all of Am Yisrael is family. So this story is there to teach us that events that don't happen directly to us still impact us, and we have to feel ourselves as part of them. That's what we affirm on Pesach night. That's what we feel, and in some way I think it's what brings so many Jews back to the Seder table, even if they don't observe many of the other mitzvot. That feeling of peoplehood, of belonging, that what happens to one Jew happens to all of us. There's no doubt that this has been a powerful and profound theme of this post-October 7th time. The deep sense that whether this attack impacted our immediate relatives or not, and there are among us in the Bayit those whose cousins or nephews were killed or taken hostage, whether it happened to us directly or not, especially at a time like this, we strengthen our family bonds to our greater family. So perhaps in the gathering, modeled after the Bnei Brak Seder, we can ask around our tables this year, what are the ways in which we feel directly affected? And what are the ways in which we feel indirectly affected by October 7th? And since? And how do we continue to understand our place, assert our belonging to the family of Am Yisrael? This teaching of the Chidah, the idea that participants from outside the immediate circle of the descendants of slaves came together to stake their claim in the exodus and destiny of their people, that teaching could emerge from many Seders in Jewish history. But there's something particular to this Seder alone that demands our attention. You see, it happened at a very particular moment in history. The temple had been destroyed just decades earlier. Some of the participants in this Seder stood in its walls. Rabbi Tarfon served as a Kohen, a priest in the temple, and witnessed its destruction, and now was an older man. Their spiritual home had been shattered for decades, and no prophet was coming along to tell them that a new one would be rebuilt in 70 years. They were living under the oppressive rule of the Romans, suffering religious persecution, mourning the loss of the temple, and suffering from ongoing hardship. Everything felt bleak. The leadership of that generation, these rabbis needed something. They needed commiseration, they needed comfort, and they needed hope. To whom did they turn? They turned to the man that Rav Kook described in his commentary to the Siddur in the following way. Rabbi Akiva's giant soul saw the far future before him like the present. His delight in the future he could see filled his pure heart, leaving no room for anguish or despair over the shudderingly painful present, which he, Rabbi Akiva, saw as only a thin cloud cover over the shining bright sun above. These words speak for themselves. You know, sometimes we study Torah and we read the names of the sages that are being quoted. Rabbi Akiva said this, Rabbi Yehuda said this, Rabbi Meir said that. But they were more than just names in the Mishnah. Along with being imperfect humans like the rest of us, they were towering giants, and their personalities and their leadership played out with one another in striking ways. Rabbi Akiva was a beacon of hope, someone who saw possibility where no one else could. It's this same perspective on Rabbi Akiva, like Rav Kook, that drove Rav Yechiel Michal Epstein, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, a 19th century halachic work, in his commentary to the Haggadah, to explain why the sages particularly went out of their way to come together at their junior colleague's home, Rabbi Akiva in Bnei Brak. He references the stories of Rabbi Akiva's leadership. The famous story of Rabbi Akiva seeing the foxes walking through the Temple Mount together with his colleagues, and while they cried, he laughed, saying, "If the temple could be destroyed, I know it will also be rebuilt." And another story, a story right after that, in which the same sages were walking down the road and they heard the noise of the Roman multitudes enjoying themselves. They wept, but Rabbi Akiva laughed. He said, if these corrupt Romans who transgress God's will are able to live it up, how much more reward must be waiting for us who follow God's will. Rabbi Akiva would give the sages hope for a rebuilt temple, and hope that even though the wicked were prospering, there was no doubt that the actions of his colleagues, the sages, would somewhere, somehow, someday be met with far greater reward and blessing. And so, Rav Epstein explains in his commentary to the Haggadah. This is from the middle. This is how Rabbi Akiva comforted them. He assured them that God's eyes were on Israel, that they would not be destroyed, God forbid. And in the same vein, he expressed that if God could give such an outpouring of loving kindness and peace to the transgressors of God's will, how much the more so would God show mercy on Israel, that they would not be destroyed, God forbid. That is why I say, says Rav Epstein, that they were therefore indebted to Rabbi Akiva for having strengthened the hopes of Klal Yisrael immediately after the destruction. That is why they all came to his city, and to Rabbi Akiva's house specifically. Only Rabban Gamliel did not go, because he was the Nasi. And they all came to Rabbi Akiva to tell of the Exodus on the night of Passover. Rabbi Akiva saw things in a different way. Where the other sages could only see loss, he saw hope. It's extreme in a sense. Part of me wishes that they had a balance, that they cried together and laughed together. But Rabbi Akiva was off in his world of blind hope. And the sages still sought him out. They understood the necessity of hope, the impossibility of a world without it. And they also knew that sometimes they couldn't furnish that hope for themselves. They couldn't feel hopeful. So they would go to the place, to the person who could inspire them. I believe in this so deeply. When we feel hopeless, when we can't extricate ourselves from a place of hopelessness, we can bring ourselves to the people who are hopeful. The act of hope when we are hopeless is just choosing to open up ourselves to those who can see the good that must come. That's why I'm grateful these days to the people who run the WhatsApps of Good News from Israel. The ones who can see the hope, see the light, when so often we're overwhelmed by the darkness. Over the last 6+ months, countless times, I've had conversations with people who say, how can we be hopeful right now? We're experiencing the hardest time the Jewish people have had since the Holocaust. How can we express hope? It's almost an insult to our reality. And I have to disagree. The horrors of now are real, and we have to feel them in the fullest, deepest way. But so is hope. There's nothing contradictory to the horror that we live in saying that we have emerged from horror before and we will do so again. Axiomatic to Judaism is the statement that if we are despairing, we have reason to hope. We are a people of resilience. So around our Seder tables this year, if we want to honor the legacy of the rabbis who went to Rabbi Akiva, we make room for our hopelessness. And then we say, who, what is our Rabbi Akiva? How do we lift up that voice, those stories, that worldview, and give hope a seat at our Seder table? Rav Soloveitchik, in his discussions of this passage, picks up on one phrase that could have been left out from this story in our Haggadah. He reminds us that when it says that the sages were sitting there in Bnei Brak and talking about the Exodus, it could just have said they were reclining in Bnei Brak and telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt until their students came and said to them, the time of reciting the morning Shema has arrived. We would have known that they told the story the whole night because their students came and said, it's morning time. Why does the story include the words telling the story of the Exodus, Kol Oto Halayla, all that night? We know they did it the whole night because we know their students came in the morning. Rav Soloveitchik says, the extra phrase, Kol Oto Halayla, means the whole, long, dark night of our exiles and our sufferings. In that whole long, dark night, they pushed on with hope. They sought out their beacon of hope, Rabbi Akiva. They kept reminding themselves of the Exodus. of the knowledge that the day will break over this long dark night. And it will. We haven't yet gotten to what is perhaps the most famous of the readings of the Bnei Brak Seder. What was really going on that night. That it wasn't just a gathering of people who were peripheral to the Exodus experience, who nonetheless got around the table even though it didn't happen to their ancestors, because it was the story of Am Yisrael, their greater family. That it wasn't just a pilgrimage of hope, a gathering of rabbis who went to Rabbi Akiva, their Rebbe of hope. But rather, the interpretation that says that it was a night on which they conducted debate and discussion about what their political, religious, and actual response should be to the Roman oppression and persecution. Namely, the critical decision that stood in front of these rabbis. Should we throw our support behind Bar Kokhba, this emerging rebel hero who was standing up to the Romans and gathering a band of fighters around him to attempt to reassert the autonomy of the Jewish people in Judea? Rabbi Akiva ultimately did, as tradition tells us, believed in Bar Kokhba as a messianic type figure. But other rabbis around the table were not so sure. As leaders of the community, they had to hash it out. This idea, this interpretation, is expressed in an essay of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, an early 20th century Israeli rabbi and politician, and a student of Rav Epstein, whose opinion we read about in Source 6 about the Rabbi Akiva of Hope. Rav Maimon has a different take. An excerpt of it is here in Source 8. I speculate, therefore, he says, that this party, which gathered the sages of Israel from a variety of locations, had a double purpose. While its expressed goal was to engage with the memories of the past in the form of the Exodus from Egypt, the sages also hoped to discuss the issues of the day from their national religious, Dati Le'umi, perspective. They were especially concerned with the rebellion against the Roman Empire, which had recently started to develop in secret amongst the Jews of Israel, and which would culminate in the Bar Kokhba revolt and the Hadrianic War. This is a totally different take on the question of why all those rabbis traveled from their home communities to get together. It's because they had an important national conversation to have, and they knew it needed the voices of different leaders and different perspectives. What stands out to me about this theory, by the way, a completely unprovable one, which many scholars completely contest, is that it's different from the previous interpretation in which they came to remind themselves that there was hope. Instead, this one believes that they came together to speak and debate about the issues of the day. This theory places the Bnei Brak Seder as a paradigm for the idea that around the Seder table, the most pressing issues of today must come to the fore, whether they are based on the Exodus or not. If we gather on this night to affirm our shared destiny as a people, then changing the course of that destiny and shaping its engagement with the world around it belongs at the Seder. We have to talk about what we're contending with today as a Jewish people. This interpretation is much less obvious, and certainly not textually present in the lines of the story itself, which literally says that they spoke of the Exodus the entire night. But Rav Maimon wants us to imagine that they were actually speaking about something entirely different. Because he just believes that how could it be any other way? When the Jewish people is wrestling, struggling with a problem, and we gather on the Seder night, we have to talk about what's on our minds, what's on our hearts. Whether Rav Maimon's reading of the Bnei Brak Seder is convincing or not, there are two instincts in it that I think are important to highlight. The first, as we said above, is the belief that part and parcel of the Seder night must be wrestling with the questions of the day. Maybe it's at Shulchan Orech and not Magid, but we have to use this night as a chance to take stock of where we stand as a people and what we must be contending with and addressing. In fact, maybe it should be at Shulchan Orech, so as not to confuse it with the story of the Exodus. They're not the same activity, but they both belong on the Seder night. And sometimes it's too hard. I think about a member of the Bait who let me know that she was about to leave to Israel to celebrate the Seder with her family there, and that in anticipation of her journey, she asked them, What are we planning for the Seder this year to focus on the hostages and focus on the Chayalim? And they said to her, hold on. We've been living this every day for the last 200 days. Actually, what we need is to just do the Seder. Just to lean into the rituals and the songs and nothing more. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes we just have to be comforted and held by the structure of the mitzvot and the story itself. But when we can, we have to try to use that moment of gathering to talk about what we're wrestling with, what we're struggling with, contending with as a Jewish people. The second part of Rav Maimon's reading is that he acknowledges that this discussion involved serious debate. There were those in support of Bar Kochba and those opposed. Of course, they all shared the same bedrock, love and care for the Jewish people, for our physical and spiritual well-being. But for some of those rabbis, that meant supporting Bar Kochba. For others, that meant opposing him. Diametrically opposed expressions of the same feeling, love for the Jewish people. What one felt was the necessary course of action felt to the other like endangering the welfare of the Jewish people. Somehow it seems, though, that if this story is true, they engaged in those bitter and powerful debates over dinner and late into the night in a way which did not drive them apart, even though they were speaking of matters of life and death. We don't hear that Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Tarfon stopped talking to each other, or didn't keep wrestling. They dealt with the hard issues. They disagreed, and they marched forward in relationship with one another. The question of the need to share divergent opinions for the well-being of the Jewish people is the central focus of an extraordinary Pesach drasha about the Bnei Brak Seder by Rav Moshe Avigdor Amiel, a slightly younger contemporary of Rav Maimon. He was born near Vilna in the 1880s, served as a rabbi on the Russo-German border, and then became the chief rabbi of Antwerp in 1920. In 1936, he moved to Israel to serve as the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, a job for which he beat out two other candidates, by the way, none other than Rav Yitzchak Herzog, who later became the chief rabbi of Palestine, and the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. So we're talking about some heavy hitters here. In a drasha for Pesach, written in the 1920s, when Rav Amiel still lived in Antwerp, he begins by saying the same thing we have, that while this Seder took place at a certain moment in history, its messages speak to us now, 2,000 years later. Every paragraph in this drasha of Rav Amiel is gold, but it's far too long to read through on the source sheet, so let me try to summarize for you the arc of his argument. He sees the Seder night as reflecting a moment before Rabbi Akiva has become a proponent of Bar Kochba. He pictures these sages sitting around the Seder table, not being sure that Bar Kochba would be able to succeed at all, and therefore feeling themselves in despair, with no future. So they focus on the past, on the exodus from Egypt, that shining moment in the distant past, and they dream of a better future. But the here and now for them is totally bleak. And along come their students all of a sudden to say, the time for the morning Shema is here. Rav Amiel says, allegorically, what the students mean is this. No, our teachers, you're missing the point. It's not dark. We have Bar Kochba. We can stand up and reassert our autonomy and our independence and rebuild the temple. Daybreak is here. Dismiss your reservations and join us. And ultimately the sages do. Rabbi Akiva throws his support behind Bar Kochba, and many of the others do as well. And the next chapter of the story, for at least a couple years, is thrilling and exciting, with initial victories and success. A restoration of moments of autonomy for the Jewish community of Judea, with their own coinage, and an independent republic. And then the revolt is mercilessly crushed, and the Jewish community of Judea is nearly decimated, with massive displacement and the religious persecution of those who remain. And from there began our 2,000-year exile. Why did this happen, asks Rav Amiel. And he gives a completely non-historical, completely religious answer. He says, the younger generation lost their way. They started out saying, our revered teachers, the time for the morning Shema has come. But by the end, all they were saying is, it's morning time. Their passion for victory and the thrill of autonomy eroded their commitment to Torah and mitzvot, and they came to disrespect their elders so much that the rabbinic midrash teaches that Bar Kokhba suspected one of the elders, Rabbi Elazar HaModai, of treason, and he killed him. And without the spiritual protection of Rabbi Eliezer, Beitar became vulnerable. The Romans broke through and annihilated the city, and all was lost. Now, says Rav Amiel, 1800 years later in the 1920s, history is repeating itself. The young, the chalutzim, the pioneers are leading the return to Zion. But they mustn't forget the Torah, he says. And he offers a lesson from Yaakov's grandsons, Ephraim and Menashe. Remember, Menashe was the Bechor, the firstborn. But when Yosef brings his sons to his father Yaakov, Yaakov places his left, weaker hand on Menashe, the firstborn, and his right, stronger hand on Ephraim, the younger. Rav Amiel explains in an excerpt from his sermon. Get ready for this, and read it with an open heart and a curiosity. I'm going to critique some of its points, but let's just take it in. I think it's actually quite powerful. For in every person, as is known, there is the force of the right and the force of the left. And the greater strength and might belongs to the right, as is known. It's not just that the right hand and right foot are stronger than the left, but in the right brain there is greater strength than in the left brain. But the left side has one revered aspect which is not found at all in the right, and that is the heart. Our heart is on our left. Thus, when it comes to intellect which is sourced in the brain, pride of place is given to the force of the right. But when it comes to emotion based in the heart, it is completely and utterly dependent on the left alone. And so it is precisely, says Rav Amiel, when it comes to parties, he means here political, amongst people, that by and large, older people belong to the parties of the right, and the younger to the parties of the left, because the older are endowed with a calm and more deliberate intellect in which the force of the right is more pronounced, and the younger, more possessed of emotion and passion, are more influenced by the force of the left. And indeed, until today, we still see this shortcoming, that the elders lack a little bit of leftness, and the younger lack a little bit of rightness. For in truth, he says, the heart of Israel, Lev Yisrael, can perform great wonders. But painfully, the elders have the Israel, but not the heart. Their hearts are cold as stone. They don't sense or feel. They simply perform the commandments by rote without passion or self-sacrifice. Of course, there are many exceptions to this rule. Amongst the young, there is tremendous heart, and they perform the actions with passion and deep feeling, even sometimes with absolute self-sacrifice. However, the Israel, that Yisrael, is lacking in them. They brazenly transgress the Torah and its commandments, scorning obedience to their mother, their spiritual religious home. The Torah tells us that Yaakov blessed them on that day, Menashe and Ephraim, saying, "May all Israel be blessed through you. May they bless their children, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Menashe." This blessing has not lost its most basic ethical value even until today. How good it would be if only we could find a balance, a moderation, between the quality of Ephraim and the quality of Menashe. If there could be for Ephraim a little bit of the equanimity of Menashe, and for Menashe a little bit of the passion of Ephraim. How good it would be if the elders had a bit of the heart of the younger, and if the younger had a little bit of the Yisrael of the elders. Then it would not be a mere recitation in the Haggadah of our teachers, the time has come for the morning Shema, but we could say it all year round, and not simply say it, but see the daybreak with our very own eyes. There's a lot to digest here, and I have my criticisms. We never paint any group with one brush, young or old. This intergenerational setup is a little bit caricatured. I'm very wary about the characterizations about left and right-sidedness and brain strength and the dichotomy between heart and mind. And of course, this has to be read in the particular moment of the conflicts going on in early Zionism about the place of religiosity in the return to Zion. But there is a kernel of eternal truth here that we have to heed. And I want to articulate it this way. Sometimes progress weakens the depth of our connection to tradition. And sometimes tradition causes our Torah to stagnate. The dream is that they never be in conflict, but sometimes they are. And when any one of us holds up too much of one, we are lacking, and we need the counterbalance of the other. Gotta say that again. Sometimes progress weakens the depth of our connection to tradition, and sometimes tradition causes our Torah to stagnate. The dream is that they never be in conflict, but sometimes they are. When any one of us holds up too much of the one, we are lacking, and we need the counterbalance of the other. While Rav Amiel never comes back to this in his drasha, I think this is the implicit critique of the Seder night in Bnei Brak. What was wrong with it? The students weren't included. They weren't at the table. Only the elders were. So there wasn't enough cross-pollination of ideas between them. And so when, in this case, the elders were swayed to join the students, they hadn't sufficiently built relationships. The students had not internalized the dimensions of patience and sobriety that the elders brought to the conversation. And the elders yielded, rather than inviting the students to come and sit down and really engage over the substance of their differences. How different it might have looked if that had happened. We need to moderate whatever our leaning is with some of the competing value. We do that by exposure to and real engagement with the people who hold the value which is often in tension with whichever one we hold primary. When we do that honestly and faithfully, and at least this is true for me, I often find that my openness to the other side, my capacity to be touched by the other, comes from realizing that I already do contain the seeds of that other approach. It's just that I've minimized it in order to elevate the value that feels dominant to me. We all have this shared core set of values that we believe in. Security and peace and coexistence. And we lift up one that feels most potent or important to us in the moment, and in order to lean into it, we diminish the other almost out of existence. And then when someone stands up and lifts up that other value, our instinct is to see them as in conflict with us, when really they're saying something which is also a part of us, but we've diminished to strengthen the one we're leaning into at the time. So in many ways, the beginning of the journey to arriving at the Seder table with the people we disagree with is an inward one. To recognize that like Menashe and Ephraim, we are all heirs to the same genetic spiritual pool of values and traits. Some become dominant and some recessive. And the recessive ones all but disappear, but they're still there. That's why we have to engage with those who lift up the other values and open ourselves first by recognizing that those values are in us too. Part of what is so hard in this time, in this precise moment, is that every value and every feeling feels so huge that it doesn't feel like it leaves any room for any other one. What I want to share now comes from the conversations I've had with the beautiful diversity of lovers of Israel in our Bayit, and I count every member of our Bayit as a lover of Israel. Our frum, invested community members, the ones who sit next to us in shul, as we've spoken over these last 6 months. For some, or in some moments, the utter shock and devastation of the massacre of our family on October 7th, the stories of what our chayalim have endured and are enduring, the crushing reality of the hostages, is so overwhelming that when someone stands up and says, there are Gazan, innocent Gazan people who are suffering, we just can't hear it. And we think that it's an opposing point of view to our own. But they're not actually conflicting. That person is saying something which we also believe, but we haven't made room for because we're overwhelmed by the feelings and value that we're lifting up in that moment. What Rav Amiel says to us is, let them be the Ephraim to our Menashe, holding up a little something we need to lift up in ourselves. And when someone comes straight from reading that news story about the horrific suffering on the other side, and hears someone standing next to them talking about an initiative, a program for our chayalim, something to lift up our awareness of the hostages, we don't feel like we have the room to hear that thing, and yet it's so deeply true and important and a part of us too. And Rav Amiel says, let that be the Ephraim to our Menashe. When we're feeling critical or challenging of Medinat Yisrael in a particular moment, and someone stands up singing the praises of our country, our homeland, they're saying something which is true for us too, inside ourselves. Says Rav Amiel, let them be the Menashe to our Ephraim. And when we're feeling the depth of proud identification with Medinat Yisrael, and we hear someone from our community offer up a critique, we don't have the room, but we know that it's actually also a part of our shared values. And says Rav Amiel, let them be the Ephraim to our Menashe. We don't have to accept that other person's prescription of where we go from here, but we have to trust the common values we share in order to read them charitably and want to hear more about what they have to say. And we all have our red lines. And there are many, many enemies of the Jewish people out there. What I think Rav Amiel is saying to us is not to confuse our allies with our enemies. So many people around us with whom we may feel a moment of profound disagreement actually share our core pool of values. Even if we don't feel like we can hear it in that moment, be patient. Don't confuse our allies with our enemies. These are just the examples of the current moment, but they are few of many. Whether it's about Medinat Yisrael or the other polarizing issues in our community, in our society here in America, about the controversial and conflictual aspects of our open and inclusive modern Orthodox outlook, or the other differences, personal or otherwise, political, that we navigate with those we care about and share community with. We remind ourselves that just like Ephraim and Menashe were two different people, but they were all the descendants, the shared progeny of Yosef, that as Rabbi Sachs and others teach us, the four children, they're not four children. They're four parts of ourselves. When we recognize the other in ourselves, we open up ourselves to them, knowing they're our brothers, not our enemies. Finally, there's one more key to how we do this hard work best, the difficult conversations around the Seder table with our family and friends whom we love even when we disagree with them. The last dimension of the Bnei Brak Seder that we understand when we compare it to its more original counterpart. See, the Bnei Brak story is very strange in that it's not found anywhere else before it appears in the Haggadah. There's no Mishnah, Midrash that quotes this story. It seems to drop out of nowhere, plop into the middle of our Haggadah, not like most of the other texts of the Haggadah, which are taken from a Mishnah, a Midrash, or something like that. But it turns out there is another story that sounds somewhat like this one, that does occur in our rabbinic tradition, in the Tosefta. Here it is in source 10. It happened that Rabban Gamliel and the elders were once reclining in the house of Baitus ben Zunin in Lod. If you look at the Hebrew, you hear the same cadences. Ma'aseh, a story of elders, Shahayu Misubin, that were reclining. And they were involved with the laws of Pesach the whole night until the call of the rooster. Their students raised the covering of the window, or others have removed the table from in front of them, and they convened and went to the house of study. The same contours, a Seder night that lasted the whole night, reclining, elders, but there are powerful differences. The one that Rabbi Dr. Joshua Kolp points out most powerfully in his essay on the Bnei Brak Seder is the topic of conversation. It wasn't the laws of Pesach, but the story. In the Tosefta, they were having a shiur, debating the finer points of the Passover and its legislations. In Bnei Brak, they were telling the story of the Exodus. Rabbi Dr. Kolp argues that the Bnei Brak Seder was actually part of a movement that started with the Tosefta, continued on and further. A rabbinic vision whose goal was to move the Seder from one that was more exclusionary, rabbis sitting around and debating the finer points of halakha, to one that was more inclusive, giving a voice to everyone, because we can all tell a story, especially in our own voices. Especially in our own voices. Sometimes when it's hard to hear someone else's opinion, when it feels antithetical or threatening to ours, but they're around the table with us, we have to take a step back and ask their story. Sometimes it's a story we don't know about our own loved ones. What have you been experiencing in the last days, weeks, or months? What makes you tick? How did you come to hold the beliefs that you hold now? Hearing the story of another person doesn't compel us to agree with them, but it helps us understand how they come to see things so differently from the way we do. And knowing our own story helps understand what drives us to see things the way we do. We've mined the story of the Seder at Bnei Brak, the story of these 5 sages, to extract the core messages that might explain why it was introduced in our Haggadah when we don't seem to need it to fulfill the Mishnah's instructions for the Seder night. What were those key ingredients? Number 1, peoplehood. Even when the story doesn't feel like it's ours, we still tell it because it is. The story of one Jew is the story of all Jews. Hope. In the darkest moments, we turn to our Rabbi Akivas, and we bring hope to the seat at the Seder table. Identifying our shared values as we lean into addressing the difficult issues of the day. When we come to the Seder table, we say, this is our night of affirmation of being Jews. What are we struggling with as Jews? What do we want the world to look like? What are our common values, and how do they drive our vision? Openness to hearing the other and believing they offer us something we need. A journey that begins with hearing ourselves and the multiplicity of voices within ourselves, and connecting the dots from others being the Ephraim to our Menashe, the Menashe to our Ephraim. And storytelling. We understand and trust each other more when we start not with opinions or prescriptions or policies, but with stories. Who am I? And what brought me to this Seder table? Before we conclude, we have to journey backwards in time. From those 20th century rabbis whose commentary on the Bnei Brak Seder we read, in the early Zionist moment, 1,000 years earlier to the decision to put the story of the Bnei Brak Seder into the Haggadah, 1,000 years earlier to the Bnei Brak Seder itself, now well over 1,000 years before that, back to the Torah. Because this story, the story of the sages at Bnei Brak, never appears anywhere else, as we said, not in the Mishnah, not in the Tosefta, not in the Midrash. And it made me wonder, is it somehow mirroring or building itself off of a story in the Torah, as rabbinic texts so often do, and because the Torah is the lens through which we always begin our understanding of the world? I racked my brain thinking about a biblical story of a community of people in potential conflict but who were ultimately family, who sat down around the table to share a meal. And one biblical precedent came to my mind. But it was too flimsy, so I let it go. And then I was looking at a section of the Schechter Haggadah, in which Rabbi Dr. David Galinkin compiles Haggadah artwork from across the centuries, and shows how the art serves as a sort of commentary in so many powerful ways. In his collection of images of the Seder at Bnei Brak, he begins with this one. I hope you'll be able to see it all right. Hold on. This is called The 5 Sages Reclining at Bnei Brak. An art historian would do a much better job describing it than I would, but there we see them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5 sages sitting around the table, under a chandelier, 3 windows, a jug of presumably wine on the far table, and some servants assisting them along the way. Then just a few images over, Rabbi Dr. Galinkin displays the one you see here. an image 125 years older than the one we just saw called the five sages reclining at Bnei Brak. You notice that it's a mirror image of the first. Same chandelier, same three windows, same jug of wine on a table in the corner, same servants in the middle. Only now, there are more people at the table. Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and if you see the shadowed heads, 10, 11, 12. This image is called Joseph and his brothers. And it says at the bottom, Genesis 43:32. This was the proto-Seder moment I had been musing about in my head as the possible precursor to the five sages reclining at Bnei Brak. And it seems like some artist had the same thought, modeling the Bnei Brak story after Joseph and his brothers. Let's read that story together for a moment. It's in Genesis chapter 43. The brothers have just come back from convincing their father to send Benjamin down with them against his better instincts, Yehuda agreeing to take responsibility. They bring the money that they had brought down with them and had been secretly placed back in their sacks back with them, terrified that they will be caught as thieves and put in jail, along with Shimon, who's been imprisoned until they come down with Benjamin. The person in charge of Joseph's house, when they arrive, says, "All is well with you, do not be afraid. Your God, the God of your father's house, must have put treasure in your bags for you. I got your payment." And he brought Shimon out to them. A few verses later, the brothers are told that they've been invited to dine with the viceroy of Egypt. And now we hear things from his perspective, Yosef's. Looking about, he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and asked, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he went on, "May God be gracious to you, my boy." With that, Joseph hurried out, for he was overcome with feeling toward his brother and was on the verge of tears. He went into a room and wept there. Then he washed his face, reappeared, and now in control of himself gave the order, "Serve the meal." They served him by himself and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. For the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, since that would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. As they were seated by his direction, the oldest in the order of his seniority to the youngest in the order of his youth, the men looked at one another in astonishment. Portions were served them from his table, but Benjamin's portion was several times that of anyone else. Vayishtu vayishkiru imo, and they drank their fill with him. What is this fascinating moment? It's the brothers, back together for the very first time in 22 years. This meal only happens once Binyamin has been brought down and Shimon is brought out of confinement. This is the progenitors of the whole Jewish people, reunited at last, sitting down around the table. Except, of course, they're not really reunited. Yosef knows who everybody is, but the brothers don't know. So they're together, they're family, but they're also strangers. So different from one another. Canaanites at an Egyptian table. But do the brothers really not know? Did you see that part where it says that Yosef seated them in order of age? That would not be impossible to guess, but highly unlikely. When they did that, vayitmehu, they were filled with wonder. They had maybe an inkling that something special was going on. I think in a sense the midrash of the first painting image and the second is the fact that they are placed as mirror images of one another, not direct copies. Because in some small way, the meal that Yosef has with his brothers is the reverse of the Bnei Brak Seder. That Seder, the one we read about in our Haggadah, was about being in the midst of darkness, but focusing on the light of the past, the exodus from Egypt, and the light of the future, the redemption and rebuilt temple that they deeply, with Rabbi Akiva as their beacon of hope, believed was coming. This story, the Yosef story, is a mirror. It's a mirror image. They had gone through so much hardship over the last 22 years. The brothers had been through so much difficulty, separately, together. What was ahead of them was the descent to Egypt and servitude. And yet in this moment, there was wonder. There was some unexpressible connection, something unspoken, unconscious, but felt. Yosef leans into it. He orchestrates the moment. He sits down at the table with them. We don't know what they spoke about that day. I imagine, by the way, that it was day and not night, because it felt like it was a day in between two darknesses, the opposite of the Bnei Brak Seder, which was a dark moment between lights of history. And yes, the text says that they ate lechem, bread, definitely not matzah in Egypt. But you know what they did do? They drank wine together, as verse 34 says. And Rashi there quotes an extraordinary midrash that I'll share as we close. They drank together with him and became inebriated, as sometimes happens to us around the Seder table. With him they drank, but other than with him they did not drink. As Rabbi Levi said, all 22 years that he did not see them, he did not taste the taste of wine. They too did not taste the taste of wine until they saw him. That is what is written, they drank and became inebriated with him. With him they drank, but other than with him they did not drink. This was somehow a magical moment, even though they couldn't quite understand it. They hadn't been reunited because Yosef hadn't revealed himself to them. But they both all felt something had changed. The past 22 years of abstinence from alcohol could be paused. Something was shifting. This moment opened up some possibility. The reconnection, the power of being together, whether they really knew it or not, loosened them to drink together, to connect, to cross the profound thresholds that divided these Canaanites from this Egyptian, who were actually brothers. Now, admittedly, this is my midrash on comparative religious art. But, pardon me a moment. Admittedly, this is a midrash on comparative religious art. But I think it says something to us about what we're dreaming of as we gather around our Seder tables this year. Beginning with Peoplehood, knowing that what affects one member of our Jewish family affects us all. Holding on to hope, knowing that the Rabbi Akivas out there are there to show us light, to show us possibility, to show us the promise of a better future. We can't see it now, but we know it's out there. Believing that for those closer to us, as different as we may feel, we share a common bedrock of values. And something that sometimes feels so opposite to what we're feeling in this moment has a little something to contribute to broaden our perspective, because probably the seed of it is in us too, even if we're leaning in another direction in this moment. May we gather around our Seder tables this year with hope and promise and possibility, with the strength of our differences, and know that we can then say, Higi hazman kriyat shma shel shacharit. The dawn, the daybreak is coming. There is a Shema we can recite together. And may it be a Chag shel Geula, a season of true redemption. Chag kasher v'sameach.